The last Lotus shoe factory in China closed in 1999. The closing of its doors marked the true end of footbinding, a mutilating practice that dates back to the 10th century. For hundreds of years, Chinese girls engaged in footbinding to meet social expectations. Their goal was to get the ideal 3-inch golden lotus feet, which promised better marriage prospects, social status, and obedience to Confucian laws. But at what costs? In this video, we look into the heartbreaking story of footbinding. We dive into the sands of time to find out the sad truth behind this harmful practice. Why did the Chinese do it? How did they do it? These questions and more would be answered in this video, so make sure you stick around till the end. Origins. Like most ancient practices, the origins of footbinding are a blend of myth and reality. Several stories attempt to explain how the tradition started, one of which is the story of Pan Yunu. Pan Yunu's Golden Lotus Dance. Pan Yunu was the favorite mistress of the southern Qi emperor, Xiao Baozhuan. As the story goes, Pan had delicate feet, and one day she danced barefoot for the emperor on a floor decorated with a golden lotus design. Her dance was impressive, and Emperor Xiao was stunned. His eyes followed her every movement, and when the dance ended, he exclaimed that the lotus springs from her every step. His statement was a reference to the Buddhist legend of Padmavati. According to the legend, lotus sprung up from underneath the feet of Padmavati with each step he took. Xiao's comparison of Pan's dance to the legend testifies to how impressed he was. Although there is no evidence that Pan bound her feet while dancing for Emperor Xiao, it is believed that the term lotus feet originates from the story. Yaonyang. As we said earlier, there are several stories about the origins of the lotus feet. However, Yaonyang is generally considered the originator of the practice. During the 10th century Tang dynasty, Emperor Li Yu built a 6-foot golden lotus. The golden lotus was constructed with precious stones and pearls, and Emperor Li had a weird request to make to his consort, Yaonyang. He asked Yao to dance around the lotus with the points of her feet, much like a modern ballet dancer. Yao agreed. She bound her heel with silk, making it take the shape of a crescent moon, and danced around the lotus. Her graceful dance caught the interest of other upper-class women, and they began to imitate her. The practice soon spread, gaining firmer roots in the Song dynasty, which followed after the Tang dynasty fell. Entering literature. Poems dating back to 1106 contain the earliest references to footbinding. After 1248, writings about the deforming practice began to emerge. A scholar, Zheng Bangji, wrote that lotus feet should be arch-shaped and small. He also noted that the practice had gained widespread acceptance during his time. Another scholar, Che Roshi, wrote that little girls not up to 4 or 5 were subjected to pain while their parents attempted to bind their feet. I do not know what use this is, he wrote, clearly angered by the harmful practice. His writing is the earliest criticism of footbinding. The discovery of the tombs of Huang Sheng and Madame Zhou marked the earliest archaeological evidence of footbinding. Sheng was a 17-year-old who died in 1243, while Zhou died in 1274. Their feet were bound in 6-foot-long gauze strips, and Zhou was so well preserved that her feet were found to fit in the narrow, pointed shoes she was buried with. Making a lotus foot. The lotus feet were a beauty ideal for ancient Han Chinese women, and they tried to make their feet as small as possible. Chinese men also worshipped it, and from the Yuan to Qing dynasties, men drank from the 3-inch lotus shoe. It was called Toast to the Golden Lotus. As anyone can imagine, making a lotus foot is a painful process, but what you're about to discover in this video will make you cringe. Making lotus feet began when a girl was between 4 and 9 years old. During this period, the foot arch was not fully developed yet and was, for lack of a better word, malleable. It was started during the winter months as the feet were more likely to be numb. Numb feet meant the girl's pain would inevitably suffer would be significantly reduced. The process would continue all through the winter and last for about 2 years. Each foot was soaked in a warm mixture of herbs and animal blood. The mix softened the foot and aided binding. Cotton bandages 6 feet long and 2 inches wide were also prepared in the blood herbs mixture. The bandages would be used to bind the feet, gripping the mutilated feet in a death hold like an anaconda. The girl's toenails were cut as short as possible. Because the toes are pressed into the soles of the feet, toenails can cut the skin and lead to an infection. There was also the problem of ingrown toenails to consider. Next, the toes were curled under the foot and pressed down with great force, squeezing into the soles and breaking the toes. It was an agonizing process, as all her toes, besides the big toes on each foot, were pressed downwards and broken. Generally, a professional binder, or the eldest female in the family, was responsible for the initial breaking and continued care of the bound feet. It was believed that a mother would be sympathetic to their daughter's cries and not bind the feet tightly. The broken toes were held tightly under the feet while the foot was drawn down with the leg. The arch was forcibly broken, allowing the ball of the feet and heel to touch when bound together. The bandages were repeatedly wound in a figure-8 movement, starting at the inside of the foot at the instep, then carried over the toes, under the foot, and around the heel, the broken toes pressed tightly into the sole. At each pass around the foot, the binding cloth was tightened, pulling the ball of the foot and the heel together, causing the broken foot to fold at the arch and pressing the toes underneath the sole. The binding was made so tight that the girl could not move any toes, and the ends of the binding cloth were sewn to prevent her from loosening it. The binding was not yet done as it required regular care. Otherwise, it could lead to infections or decaying flesh. The bandages were loosened daily if the girl's parents were wealthy, or thrice a week if they were peasants. When unbound, the toes were checked for infection. The toenails were trimmed, and the foot was kneaded to soothe the pain and soften the foot. The soles of the feet were often beaten to make the toes and joints more flexible. The feet were soaked in a concoction to make decaying flesh fall off. After the checkup was done, the toes were curled underneath the feet once again, and the feet were bound tighter than before. The binding procedure was irreversible because once the foot was broken and crushed, it would take the same amount of pain to straighten it back. Why did the Chinese practice foot binding? Earlier in the video, we talked about the discovery of Lady Huangsheng's skeleton in a tomb. Lady Sheng was the wife of an imperial clansman, and the embroidered lotus shoes found in her grave could be mistaken for toy shoes. Anyone without prior knowledge of foot binding would disagree vehemently that an adult's feet would fit into it. Foot binding was an excruciating process. It meant breaking both the toes and the arch of the foot. For a child, the pain would be unimaginable. Then, we should also consider that bound feet could become infected and cause gangrene, leading to the loss of a foot or both feet. Also, foot binding limited mobility. Women with bound feet rarely left their homes, and when they walked, they had a swaying gait. More so, some women could not walk barefoot and must wear lotus shoes to move about. With all these glaring disadvantages for them to see, why did the Chinese continue the practice for so long? Foot binding began in the 10th century Song dynasty and lasted until the 1950s. Why was it not stopped? Beauty ideal or erotic fetishism. One of the reasons it lasted for so long was that foot binding was a beauty ideal, and a woman with 3-inch golden lotus feet was considered beautiful. In most ways, foot binding was simply another incredulous beauty standard set for women, as has been done in various cultures worldwide since the beginning of time. During the Victorian era, having a tiny waist was the beauty ideal, and Victorian women sought it with comical fanaticism. In today's world, the figure 8 body is the ideal, and plastic surgery has become popular due to it. The same could be said for the foot binding, which the Chinese practiced. A poor woman could marry into wealth if she had the perfect feet. Men of that era saw bound feet as a status symbol and sought after women with golden lotus feet. They also considered bound feet to be sexually pleasing, and foot binding had erotic undertones in Chinese culture. Women with bound feet used their thigh and buttocks muscles for support when they walked, producing a particular sort of gait that was considered erotic. The smaller the foot, the more attractive the prospective bride was. And so it was. Even if you had 4-inch silver lotus feet, you could marry into a well-to-do family. Feet larger than 4 inches, called iron lotuses, were considered ugly, and women with such feet might never get married and could resign themselves to farming in the rice fields. In fact, in most peasant families, the eldest daughter had her feet bound so she could attract wealthy suitors, while her sisters with ugly feet did the farm work. Beyond the beauty ideal, foot binding might also have been the unfortunate result of a national foot fetish. The Tang dynasty tale of Yexian, written around 850 by Duan Chengshi, shows that the Chinese already admired small feet before foot binding took root in their culture. In Chengshi's tale, a girl lost her shoe and married a king who sought the shoe's owner as only her foot was small enough to fit the shoe. The tale is believed to be one of the antecedents of the European story of Cinderella. Chinese men worshipped the lotus feet. Some men loved the smell of bound feet, an awkward behavior given that bound feet typically smelled bad because the binding strips were not washed regularly. Some men also believed that bound feet made folds develop in the vagina, thighs become sensuously thicker, and make the vagina tighter. How valid these claims were is up for debate. The psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud considered foot-binding part of foot fetishism. He thought it to be imposed on women by a patriarchal society due to male castration anxiety, a term that describes the masculine fear of loss of genitals. In essence, the Chinese culture disfigured women's feet to appease men's desire for dominance. No doubt all that has been said would have a feminist seething. The idea that a young girl's feet would be broken repeatedly over time, putting her through unimaginable pain, all for the arousal of the patriarchy, would make Elizabeth Stanton rise from the dead. But foot-binding was not done only for marriage. It was also an identity, feminine identity and Confucian ideals. In 1279, the Mongols invaded China and assumed control over the Chinese state. Historians have argued that the Mongolian conquest contributed to the spread of foot-binding as it became an expression of the identity of a Han woman. It was their way of maintaining superiority over the foreigners. The practice persisted after the Manchus' conquest in 1644. The Manchus attempted to ban the practice during the Qing dynasty but failed. It has been argued that the attempts to ban foot-binding in China may have in fact led to its spread among Han Chinese in the 17th and 18th centuries. Beyond cultural identity, foot-binding was also a form of gender identity. Foot-binding was only done by women on girls, whether it was a professional footbinder or the girl's grandmother. It was customary that a female did it. In Chinese society, foot-binding was part of the female domain and was a primary distinction between the genders, a lesson laid out at an early age. It can also be considered a form of discipline undertaken by women. Mothers let their daughters' feet be bound to inform them of their role and position in society. In other words, foot-binding was the pink dress of a Han girl child, the earliest identification of her gender, and perhaps the most influential physical and psychological event in her formative years. The gender identity argument also ties in with the discussions concerning the role of Confucianism in perpetuating mutilation. During the Song dynasty, Neo-Confucianism was instituted in China, which is believed to have influenced the spread of foot-binding. Neo-Confucianism was, in every respect, a state religion and would have a strong hold on Chinese culture for centuries. Neo-Confucianism promoted female seclusion and widow chastity, which were invariably worsened by foot-binding. Some believe that the prominent Song dynasty scholar Zhu Xi promoted foot-binding as a way to encourage chastity. Lotus feet restricted movement and kept women in their homes, supposedly ensuring chastity as the women could not go out to meet with lovers. Foot-binding also fits into the Confucian ideals of civility and culture. It was seen as a necessary part of being feminine and considered part of clothing. For example, a Chinese encyclopedia from 1591 placed foot-binding in a section on female adornments that included hairdos, powders, and ear piercings. A case of female subjugation. Qiu Jin, an early Chinese feminist and national heroine, endured the agonizing process of unbinding her feet. She was vocal about the ills of foot-binding, which was widespread during the Qing era in which she lived. The Manchu government eventually executed her for her attempt to overthrow the government. Still, she was immortalized in Chinese culture, and her ideas and the life she lived helped inspire the revolution she dreamed of. Like Qiu Jin, most Chinese feminists strongly opposed foot-binding, which they saw as an oppressive practice against women. They considered it a form of chauvinistic violence against women and argued that it made women heavily dependent on their families and husbands. Bound feet restricted women to their homes and increased their reliance on their husbands, leaving them vulnerable to their spouse's whims and domination. Because their bound feet limited them to only domestic handwork like sewing, they had no choice but to rely on their husbands to provide for them. Jin argued that end the foot-binding practice and young girls should get an education. Her opposition to foot-binding was rooted in her own experience before she unbound her feet and her failed marriage. She had been born into a wealthy home, and the practice was more common among the elite. Her parents had arranged her marriage to the son of a wealthy merchant, and it was a loveless marriage. After she got out of it, she became involved in female activism and revolutionary activities. Jin believed that the only way for young girls to gain independence and escape what she felt was female subjugation was through education. She challenged them to develop new mental and physical qualities that would help them achieve more, as she foresaw the end of the Manchu government and believed the coming era would not need women who were confined to their homes. Decline and ban in China. Chinese scholar Che Ruoxi was one of the earliest people to condemn footbinding, which he thought had no use to women and society. Some Confucian moralists like Cheng Yi and Tu Weiming also condemned footbinding, which they believed went against Confucian teachings that it was prohibited to injure even the hair and skin of the body received from mother and father. Thus, Confucianism regarded footbinding as simple since it meant deforming a part of the body. However, opposition against footbinding began to take a feminist perspective with the arrival of Europeans in China. The first European to mention footbinding was Italian missionary Oddone of Pordenone, who visited China during the 14th century Yuan dynasty. Subsequently, Christian missionaries to China were appalled by the practice and returned to Europe with vivid tales and descriptions of footbinding that left their audience shocked and disgusted. As the eras of dynasties gave way to republicanism and communism, footbinding became a major symbol of China's backwardness. China was no longer the most powerful nation in Asia, a position Japan had taken, and the need to get rid of cultural vestiges that weakened the country decreased the popularity of footbinding. The process was slow, and it was not until the 1950s that footbinding effectively ended in China. The early abolishment efforts. In 1636, the Qing dynasty began with the Manchu leader Hong Taiji as the first Qing ruler. One of the issues he sought to end was footbinding, and he issued edicts to ban the practice. 2 years later, more decrees were given, and in 1664, the Kangxi Emperor continued the ongoing efforts to ban the practice. However, neither of them could end the practice. Most Han Chinese ignored the laws and continued to bind their feet. Their non-compliance eventually forced the Kangxi Emperor to give up his efforts in 1668, and by the 19th century, about 50% of Chinese women had lotus feet. The statistics were almost 100% for upper-class Han Chinese women. Perhaps we can attempt to give a crude explanation for this. Why was it so popular? Footbinding was a self-fulfilling cycle. By the time the Manchus tried to end the practice, it was so entrenched in the culture that it was nearly impossible to do so. Bound feet were a beauty ideal and a prerequisite for finding a husband, because it restricted their mobility, which made them better at handwork, and was considered a mark of obedience to Confucianism. Women with bound feet were status symbols and believed to make better wives. Thus, fathers told their sons to seek brides with golden lotus feet, which made mothers tell their daughters that no man would marry them if they did not have a 3-inch foot. Footbinding was also a means for women to marry into wealthy families in regions such as Sichuan. It was common practice in Guangdong at the tail end of the 19th century to bind the feet of the eldest daughter of a working-class family who was to be brought up as a lady. Her younger sisters would grow up to be bond servants or domestic slaves and be able to work in the fields, but the eldest daughter would be assumed never to need to work. The anti-footbinding movement. In the mid-19th century, the Hakka leaders of the Taiping Rebellion outlawed footbinding in regions they controlled, but the rebellion failed and the practice persisted. When the Taiping Rebellion stopped, the Christian missionaries took over. One of the earliest Western anti-footbinding societies, called the Heavenly Foot Society, was formed in 1874. Its first meeting was in Xiamen and was presided over by the missionary John McGowan, with about 70 women in attendance, and its members vowed not to bind their daughters' feet. Another group, the Natural Foot Society, was formed in 1895 by Christians in Shanghai, led by Alicia Little. With the backing of the Woman's Christian Temperance Movement, founded in 1883, and missionaries like Timothy Richard, these Christian societies made a stronger impact than earlier Chinese opposition. Western missionaries established the first schools for girls and encouraged women to end the perpetuation of the practice of footbinding. Gladys Aylward, a British missionary, is immortalized for her valiant attempts in eradicating footbinding in China. She had been appointed foot inspector and was greatly successful in making the Han Chinese stop the practice. Her devotion and kindness to the Chinese and her commitment to ending footbinding endeared her to many. Her popularity grew after the release of the movie The Inn of the Sixth Happiness. Christian missionaries were not alone in the struggle against the deforming practice. Chinese intellectuals intent on reforms also took up the fight, emphasizing the need for foot-binding to be eliminated if growth is to be achieved by the Chinese state. In 1883, Kang Youwei founded the Anti-Foot-Binding Society near Guangzhou to combat the practice, and anti-foot-binding societies sprang up across the country, with membership for the movement claimed to reach 300,000. Many members of anti-foot-binding groups pledged to not bind their daughters' feet, nor to allow their sons to marry women with bound feet. However, patriotism rather than feminism fueled the anti-foot-binding movement. Its supporters argued that better health and efficient labor can be achieved with the abolition of foot-binding. Some of these reformers also stressed that education was important for women, and the lack of it was responsible for national weakness. It was even argued that women with bound feet produced weak sons, and were the cause of China's decline in power within Asia. Complementing the efforts of the anti-foot-binding movement was the natural effects of China's industrialization. The rise of textile industries and the likes of it made lotus feet economically unrewarding. Previously, embroidery and clothes were made in homes by wives and daughters. Now these products are being made by factory workers. Having a lotus feet became a disadvantage, and by the 20th century, a new cultural wave was sweeping through China. In 1902, Empress Dowager Cixi issued an anti-foot-binding edict, but it was soon rescinded. Luckily, the Xinhai Revolution of 1911, which led to the overthrow of the Qing dynasty, further fueled the movement against foot-binding. The new Republic of China, under Sun Yat-sen's leadership, officially banned the practice in 1912, although enforcement varied across regions. The government initiated widespread campaigns to promote gender equality and eliminate oppressive practices. These campaigns included educational programs and social reforms aimed at empowering women and eradicating foot-binding, marking a significant shift in Chinese society. Despite the ban, foot-binding continued in some rural areas for years due to traditional beliefs and resistance to change. It took time to eradicate the deeply ingrained customs associated with foot-binding. The creation of the People's Republic of China under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party marked the beginning of the complete eradication of foot-binding. By the mid-20th century, foot-binding had largely disappeared in China. The last new case was reported in 1957, and only few old women still have bound feet in China. The abolishment of this practice was a testament to the resilience of reformers and women's determination to assert their rights and reject a painful tradition. It symbolized a turning point in China's journey towards modernization and gender equality. It also highlights the profound impact of external influences and changing political landscapes on cultural practices. The journey from the Qing dynasty to the People's Republic of China was marked by a long and arduous struggle to break free from the chains of foot-binding, ultimately leading to its complete abolition. When the Zhiqian Shoe Factory in Harbin, China's last lotus shoe factory, closed its gates in 1999, it was the final marker of China's eradication of the oppressive practice. It also marked the end of the revolution Qiu Jin fought and died for, as well as immortalized the legacy of Gladys Aylward, whom the Chinese called the Virtuous One. Finally, it was a testament to the victory of Chinese feminism and feminists worldwide. It is a testament that one step at a time, soon enough, the world would be a better place for our mothers, daughters, sisters, and nieces.